It's Saturday, August 9th, and severe weather is going to affect multiple regions today. And those regions are going to be up here in the Midwest and then back in the central and southern upper plains. We do have a slight risk in both of those areas, specifically covering eastern Colorado, then back into eastern Iowa and southern Wisconsin. And both those will be surrounded by a marginal risk of severe weather. Our marginal risk down here in our southern and central plains risk area stretches a bit further down into the Texas Panhandle, and our marginal risk pretty much covers our slight risk area, except it just stretches a bit wider and a bit more southwest. And some strong damaging winds are going to be a big part of our severe weather risk today. We do have a large risk covering our slight risk area up here in the Midwest for some 60 to 70 mile an hour damaging winds. I would expect that to be closer to the 60 mile an hour end of that line. And then back in our southern and central plains marginal risk area, we could potentially see some 60 to 70 mile an hour gust as well. And there is going to be a much smaller risk of seeing some hail out here in the Midwest. It's actually going to be a smaller risk area too, being confined to most of that slight risk area where we could see potentially anywhere between 1 to 1.5 inch in diameter hail. And we actually could see some pretty large hail in that 2 to 3 inch range out here in eastern Colorado today. And I actually do think there is a conditional threat for some small hail, which also stretches down into the Texas Panhandle as well, probably only being around 1 inch in diameter. And then there is also a threat of a couple of weak spin-up tornadoes in both of our slight risk areas today. And on top of our severe threat, there is going to be a significant threat of flash flooding today. We have a moderate risk out here in parts of eastern Iowa and southern Wisconsin, where we are expecting to see widespread swaths of 5 to 6 inches of rain. So definitely something to be weather aware out there today. Look for flash flood warnings. Then in other areas which we could see the potential for large amounts of rainfall, and potentially the small threat for flash flooding would be back in our eastern Colorado risk area, southeastern Arizona, and then back in the far southeast, mostly central Florida and the eastern parts of Georgia and South Carolina. That would just be for the conditional threat of 1 to 2 inches of rainfall in those areas. And it's going to be a very hot day once again for parts of the central and southern plains, and even back into the Midwest, where we are expecting to see some mid to high hundreds feels like temperatures, and other areas which could potentially see some hotter than usual temperatures would be up in the Great Lakes region and around the Mississippi River Valley. Then back into Florida, of course, that would be where we're expecting to see some mid 90s feels like temperatures, and then pretty much everywhere out west is going to be sitting in that mid 80s feels like temperatures range, except the central California Valley, where it looks like we could see widespread 102 feels like temperatures today. And then here's what our radar is going to look like in our Midwest risk area today. We're going to see that we could potentially see the first line of strong to potentially lower echelon severe storms in parts of western Iowa in the very early morning hours today. Right after daybreak, this would be initiated by a remnant low pressure system in a short wave pushing northeastward. Then also, of course, that cold front, which is going to be the main driver of all those storms, and that big troughing as well. And this would likely bring the threat for some small hail, not really the threat of spin up tornadoes, but mostly just some lower damaging winds, probably around 60 miles an hour. And then this would push northeastward and likely fall apart before midday, just bringing a lot of rain. Now, I think our main line of concern is going to develop in the mid to late afternoon hours, and that's going to be in eastern Iowa, in parts of southern Wisconsin, and that's going to bring that threat of all hazards of severe weather. So potentially tornadoes, small hail, but mostly damaging winds in that 60 to 70 mile an hour range. And this is going to be initiated by a lot of the same stuff as our first cluster of storms, that cold front, troughing, and a short wave moving through the area. Now, one of the reasons for a tornado threat is that our shear vectors are actually going to be somewhat parallel to our big line of storms. So this can sometimes spin up some little pockets of vorticity and thus spin up tornadoes. Now, this would likely last around till nightfall before it loses its severe characteristics. And there is actually the potential for some storms initiated by outflow in sort of the wake of our main cluster. Now, the HRRR actually likes to overcook these a bit, so I wouldn't be surprised to see some strong storms because this coincides with some persistent troughing activity in the area, and there is going to be the low-level jet along, assumably, an outflow boundary, but this would be behind the cold front at that point, so the ingredients back here would be a lot less. But I think this would mostly just be some weaker gusty winds, not being in that severe range, and also quite a bit of rain. This is one of the reasons for that large flood risk out here today, and this would come right after nightfall in the early night hours. And then for the radar in our second area of concern back here in the southern and central upper plains, we're going to see some storm initiation likely in the late afternoon around that upper plains convergence zone area. This will be assisted by some troughing in the area as well, then we could actually see some convergence up here in parts of western Nebraska, also bringing the conditional threat of some severe storms. But our main risk area would be anywhere from eastern Colorado to the Texas Panhandle, with a focus on eastern Colorado. These will have the potential to bring some very large hail in that 2 to 3 inch range and some isolated damaging gusts anywhere between 60 to 70 miles an hour. And the same thing would go for our Texas Panhandle storms, except these would be more likely to be on that damaging wind gust threat instead of a hail threat. And there is also going to be the conditional threat of a couple of spin up tornadoes with our storms back here in eastern Colorado. So absolutely something to stay weather aware about. Then for our storms back here in the Texas Panhandle, our trough will be a bit more north. So there definitely are some other things which will help to initiate this. Of course, there will be a stationary front which will have passed. And that's actually going to be the same stationary / cold front which initiated our storms back in the Midwest. Then there is also expected to be the development of a low pressure system. Then this is also going to be helped by the dry line and the upper plains convergence zone magic. And these storms will likely last a little past the evening hours, even when that low level jet kicks in. And that is actually when our tornado risk is going to maximize out here in eastern Colorado. Then that all hazards of severe weather could also be potentially increased for a bit when that low level jet kicks in. But after that, these storms are likely going to fall apart by the very early morning hours on Sunday. And then looking at our very large trough, this is going to be the main causer for most of our severe weather today. We're going to see that still digging in over the northern plains, but it's bringing a lot of initiating and organizing flow to our main risk areas. We're going to see a couple of short waves, one in the very morning hours, bringing that first cluster of storms. Then later in the afternoon, we're going to see another one eject to help to initiate our storms as well. We're also going to see a bit of a kinker shortwave back here in our eastern Colorado / upper and southern plains risk area as well. Then there's also going to be some noticeable flow down here in the Texas Panhandle, which could be that reason for those cluster of storms as well. Then here's the environment in our Midwest risk area, bringing that threat of all hazards of severe weather and potentially some significant flooding. Our photograph doesn't look all too special, and relatably, our shear isn't really looking all that great at all. But the main things organizing and keeping our cluster alive will be that shortwave pushing through and that cold front. So there's definitely still things that are helping to initiate it, but mostly it's just going to be an extremely moist environment in the upper 70s dew points, and also an extremely unstable environment around 5,000 Cape. Then also our 3 Cape is going to be extremely high, around 200, which also is one of the reasons why there is a elevated threat for a couple of spin up tornadoes along our line. And then just general severe weather, and our lowest cloud level or cloud base will also be low enough to support that. But these are all things which are going to make severe weather definitely very possible out here in the Midwest. Then driving our flooding threat is going to be a extremely high precipitable water, around 2.16 inches. That is very, very high. So that's going to bring that flooding threat, and also the threat of a couple of stronger downdrafts and damaging winds. Then for our hail threat, although our storm mode is going to be linear and our bulk shear is very low, we do have a pretty high lapse rate, 8.5 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, and quite a bit of Cape up here near our freezing level. So despite that, I do think we could still see some small hail in that 1 inch in diameter range. And then here's our environment in our central and southern upper plains risk area, also bringing that threat of all hazards of severe weather today. We see a very straight photograph, and that's also going to be related to the very large amount of bulk shear that we're expecting out in this region, around 50 knots. So definitely some very strong updrafts and some organized storms. This is also going to be coupled with some wind veering, also helping to do some organized storms. Now our cloud base would be low enough to support potentially a couple of isolated tornadoes. However, I do think that risk is pretty small, although it's definitely still possible to see a couple. But if we were to, they'd be pretty weak. We also see quite a bit of dry air aloft, which is going to help to increase our threat of some damaging winds. And our relative humidity is going to be around 50%. So some evaporative cooling. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some damaging gusts around 60 to 70 miles an hour out here in this risk area today. And then the main thing is that we have a pretty moist environment for the area and elevation, and a pretty unstable environment around 3,500 Cape. So just very favorable for severe weather in general. But the main thing looks like it's going to be a hail threat because of our extremely large amount of bulk shear and likely strong updrafts, and also discrete mode. We also have quite a bit of Cape up here, coupled with a pretty high lapse rate, 8.3 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. So mostly the threat of some hail around 2 to 3 inches in diameter, the conditional threat for some damaging winds, 60 to 75 miles an hour, and a very low threat for some weak spin up tornadoes. But the upper plains convergence zone magic sometimes gets funky, so I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see a couple out here today.